Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I've been promised some tough love in this session, so I'm very excited about it. I wondered if we could start off by each of you introducing yourselves and telling us a little bit about your background and history in the payments world.
Sure. So I can start. Hi, Reetika Grewal. I run payment strategy and solutions at Silicon Valley Bank. I've been in the payment space for over 15 years. At Silicon Valley Bank, I have a really unique role. I work with startups that are early stage all the way through to giant corporations that are trying to bring payments into their solutions. So if they are launching a new product or they have an existing product and they want to embed a new experience, we help them bring it to life, thinking about things like scalability, sustainability, and regulatory compliance. So I joke and say I play a lawyer on TV because everything that we do has to go through all those different filters and different acronyms around AML, KYC, OFAC, all of those things. In addition to that, my team, we run an accelerator program in conjunction with First Data called Commerce Innovated, where we work with early stage companies, seed and Series A funded companies to help bring their solutions to market. It's a 4-month program, and we offer them mentorship. And we do investments, too.
Jay Reinemann. So my primary experience with payments is a dozen years at Visa, which helped educate me and a little bit make me a skeptic also, just because market share, from an investor perspective, it's a tough place to enter. But Propel, we're a Series A investor based out of the US. We invest globally. We've only invested in 2 payments companies right now. One of them is SumUp here in Europe, but looking for more.
And I wonder, you both have experience, Jay, as you just referred to, in both the sort of more traditional payments and banking world in the US, as well as insight into tech companies and startups and fintechs globally. I wondered if I could start off by asking you each to say how the real-time payments landscape has changed over your career and how you would describe it right now.
I'm not so sure it's changed. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it, but I haven't seen a lot of action yet. I mean, I don't know. You're the real pro.
Yeah. Being in the payment space, people, especially in the startup payment space, people are always asking, like, what's new, what's different? And at the end of the day, the underlying infrastructure, at least in the US, has stayed the same, right? It's still the card networks.
Yeah, how do you break that?
The card networks, the low-value clearing, like wires. The payment infrastructure is the same. It's just the things that are being built on top of it to optimize are changing, right? Like things like APIs are making it easier to connect and get information back, turning one-way systems into two-way systems. And so, like, that's changed. I mean, outside of the US and the UK, like, faster payments in Europe is a real thing, but it hasn't come to the US yet.
Yeah, a couple of Americans on the panel. It's
not
a good thing. Like we're sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you see the influence of the UK or the existence of real-time payments here coming to or in any way influencing the US market or spilling over?
Maybe trying, but again, I think it's more talk than action. Partially because of the infrastructure, it's really hard to change the infrastructure.
Yeah. Yeah. There's initiatives that people are trying in the U.S., but the infrastructure is so rigid, and when you make changes, you have to make a lot more changes. I think I said this yesterday, right? There's 7,000 banks in the US. And so for everyone to get on board with a new rule or a new way of doing things takes a really long time, let alone getting everyone to agree in the first place. And so, I've been in conversations around real-time payments and, thinking about like, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of like how you do accounting compared to today's batch systems? What does that mean in terms of processes? What does it, there's just a lot to think through that I don't think is going to be a quick thing to tackle in the U.S.
You made a point when we were talking about this before that in the US, real-time payments might not exist, but it's so close as to look like it. what exactly do you mean, I guess, is the question.
So, I think today, from a consumer's perspective, right, you use your credit card and it shows up immediately in your online banking as a pending transaction. So, like, mentally, it looks real time. For the merchant, they have a system where they start sort of tracking the transactions, and then it settles into the bank. And so people have, it's 2 days to clear end to end, but the way that they sort of think about the inflow of money, like when you've got an authorized transaction, it's guaranteed money, right? Essentially. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't, like you said at the beginning, is it something consumers care about? And I'm not so sure that it's from a venture perspective. I don't think it's something to hang your hat on. That's my pitch to the market, just because I think it's kind of table stakes, and I think you can kind of fake it, that it's quasi real time if you get into an SM. But there are some consumer segments where it matters. I mean, the guys that are living paycheck to paycheck, of course, they want to see that not just pending, but they want it to happen because they need the money.
Right.
But I still think generally most consumers probably aren't going to care that it's 1 or 2 days. SMBs, enterprises, a lot more important.
Yeah.
Because that float matters.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think that's where some of the innovation is happening too. Like the real push to electronic payments is happening on the B2B side, right? And because they have a much bigger a bigger ability to push for changes they want to see, and they've got sort of teams of people thinking about like how to maximize their float and their money. And I think that, like, you talked a little bit about the consumer workforce, and I call it sort of the little b, the 1099 workforce, like their need for money. Like, we've heard stories through some of our clients about like a contract worker working a shift specifically for something they're doing that evening, and getting the money to fund that evening's activities is really important. And so, I think we were talking a little bit about something like some of the networks are doing around pushing money to cards in order to help expedite the payments for those kinds of transactions.
So who are some of the, in this sort of narrow or narrower than maybe many startups would like economy, who are some of the startups who are doing the most interesting things?
Pregnant pause.
You mean in reference to just in payments in general, or?
Real-time payments, so whether it's the SMB and enterprise payments that Jay mentioned, or the sort of 1099 worker economy that you brought up.
No, I mean, I think there's a few different companies just off the top of my mind that we're working with that like are helping that 1099 workforce like either advance their salary or smooth their salary, right? So that you drive 10 shifts a month, and on average you make whatever $50 a shift or something. That's not the right number, but they can look at your sort of activity and say, okay, so on average you make $500 a month. Let's just give you that $500 up front to smooth it out. And so there's those kinds of solutions, or like factoring solutions and things like that to help get money in the hands of that workforce faster.
The supply chain finance business.
And then the other part that there's a lot of innovation around this segment is around like I call it sort of HR benefits, right? So like if you're a 1099 worker, you don't have a health plan, or you don't have a way to pay back your tuition and stuff like that. So there are solutions out there that are trying to connect paychecks from these different kinds of providers to help fund some of those things, because you still have those expenses that you need to pay.
Jay, can you talk a little bit about SMB and enterprise real-time payments and which players are doing the most innovative things there?
So of course, I need to talk about one of our portfolio companies.
Of course.
Taulia. They're in the supply chain finance. They enable companies to get paid faster. And it's not a new industry, but something with technology they've been able to certainly improve the margins. I think from a consumer business side, that's certainly a pretty good opportunity. From a consumer side, I'm a little bit more skeptic, as I said, just because I think part of the Visa in me kind of says, how do you do it? Like, how do you compete against these guys that have the capillarity or the of the network of the merchant and the consumer side? It's really hard to build that right now. So I think I'm an optimist as an investor to try to look for something that's going to do it. And there's been a lot of hope about blockchain being the new technology to enable that.
Thank you for saying that word.
But still, the game's not over.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the blockchain. I mean, what is the promise and what have we seen so far? And, you know, what is the potential there?
You know, it's been an awkward space just because I think there was this hype and then there was a sort of a nuclear winter for a couple of years and then it came back and now I don't know where we are really. And we've seen some good solutions, but I think the hard part is like where the rubber meets the road. Like a lot of these guys are still trying to figure out, and like in getting the incumbent industry, the rails involved here has not been easy because the regulators are not making it easy. Because in Europe, the regulator says banks can't touch it, and so you've got to do sort of all sorts of unnatural acts to participate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the use cases that we've seen getting the most traction are around the international remittance space, leveraging crypto in order to help facilitate money movement. Companies like Veeam and Ripple and things like that, and companies like that. And so I think that space is ripe for disruption and ripe for more speed, just transparency, security to be added in. So I think those are sort of the use cases that have been sort of the most, you know, as we're talking about real-time payments, right? That those have been sort of the most, have gained the most traction.
So for the people in this room, people who may have companies or want to start companies in the payments and especially the real-time payment space, what would your advice be?
You know, the U.S. is a very hard place to start a real-time payments business. I think, like, embarrassingly enough, we still write so many checks, right? And I, like, literally just tried to pay my piano, we were talking about this, my piano teacher the other day via electronic payment, and he just refused. He wanted a paper check. And so, you know, I think that the friction there and sort of like check numbers in the U.S. are still like taboo. You can't share them. If you need to pay somebody, you need to use a different kind of key of some sort, like an email address or a phone number. You can't use an account number. Whereas I think that that's a big barrier that's been removed here. Like we had this client who was really excited about an advertising campaign that they launched and they got on TV and they showed this giant check as part of the storyline, and it was their actual checking account number in the commercials. So we had to change all their checking account numbers at the bank, right? Because it's still like we mail checks everywhere, but we still, you know, like you're still supposed to guard your account number. And so like that's the friction that you're dealing with in the US. And because, you know, on the coasts, you've got some people that are super technically savvy, but in the middle of America, there's just such a disparate knowledge around electronic payments. So.
I don't think I have any secret answers to that question about what should you guys do. I think, but you do need, it's a big opportunity. Of course, payments is huge. But I think trying to create your unique value proposition is tough. But I think there's still a lot of pain out there. Like a friend of mine was telling me yesterday, in the POS space, the point of sale where you do your swipes, 60% of the POS devices, I think globally as well as in the US, are still dial-up.
Oh, really?
Dial-up
Wow.
modems. I mean, talk about not real time. And then the other 40%, of course, are IP-based. That seems like an opportunity right there. Like, why is there so much dial-up modem still?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, all the stuff that we're seeing in our application pool for the accelerator program is really, really focused on the B2B payment space these days.
Okay.
There's a lot less on the consumer payment side that we are seeing.
Well, I think because there's not a lot of room left in P2P. I think it's free, And that's table stakes. You got to do free.
Right. And you can't just have a P2P solution. You have to have a lot more around it in order for it to be worthwhile, right? You need a way for people to like spend the money that they're collecting. So.
Well, in a post PayPal Venmo world, is there any opportunity for anyone else to enter that market in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
like Square's doing
if you
it.
could figure out a way to like pay the consumer for the transaction. It's not just free, but no, you get paid. All right, I'd love to see that idea.
Yeah.
Acquisition costs.
Someone's
got to
do that.
Yeah, you're going to fund that one?
Venture backed.
Yes. Well, you both work with banks that have exposure to global companies, and Jay, you're affiliated with a Spanish bank. What's the landscape like in Europe and in the UK, and what sorts of opportunities do you see here for companies you may want to invest in or work with?
Europe's tough from a payments perspective because the regulators have, like in Spain, they don't make any money on interchange. So you got to figure out what the value add is. It's almost like a giveaway business to get the other sides of the business for the merchants.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's the same in the U.S. It's payments in and of itself is such a low margin business. So it's all about everything that you put around it, right? Like iZettle, obviously, huge outcome, and it's because it's much more than just payment acceptance. There's a lot more to it, and the value that they put around it. Stripe is another great example. Like they continue to build out the platform. It's much more than just accepting the payment. It's how do you track the payment? How do you track it into your accounting? How do you separate it? If you're a marketplace, there's just building the suite of services around it to be able to command a premium on payments is really sort of what we're seeing in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. Adding in lending, adding in other services as well.
Right. Are there any other, you mentioned Stripe, iSettle, any other standouts that you would call out?
It's like picking my favorite child. I can't do it, even though my kids try to make me do it.
Sum up. They're a
portfolio company?
Of course. And I love the fact that iZettle got acquired because SumUp was basically about the same size as iZettle. So I hope that's a good outcome. Other favorites? I don't know. How about you?
I'm agnostic. I'm just the moderator.
No opinion?
But I did want to ask, Reetika, you brought up some fallen soldiers last night, and I wondered...
Oh, please. Tell us. You were reluctant to talk about...
Yeah, no. So I've worked at a few different startups in my career, and one of them was a huge learning experience. That's the way I like to call it. I worked for a company called Pay by Touch.
Does anybody know who Pay by Touch is?
No. So it was a biometric authentication for payments before biometrics was. I know it was a really advanced concept. And so what I was doing there was to build a online payments product that was biometric optional. And so it was ahead of its time. And their first deployment was going into grocery stores and allowing people to check out with your fingerprint. There was several lessons learned. But the biggest one was the investment that they had to make in the actual technology they deployed at each location. Like they put these massive enrollment kiosks, and you had to go through this experience.
Even the consumer fear of I'm going to give my fingerprint. What is
Yeah,
that gonna do?
Back then it was a thing, and they're like, "Oh, people are going to cut off my finger." I'm like, "No, I'm not going to cut off your finger." And so there was just the industry has evolved tremendously in terms of form factors that people are willing to do. You use your fingerprint every day on your device,
right?
So
how'd that turn out? Pay by Touch. What's the end of the story?
The end of the story is it exploded. They raised, I think, $400 million, and it was good. Like I said, learning experience.
Although to that point, is there any space now that Apple and other devices have made it, every day for us to use our biometrics and our fingerprints? Is there any opportunity in that space for startups or newer companies to bring back biometric payments?
Yeah, no, there's a ton of startups that are doing things like retina scanning, heartbeat monitoring, or pulse monitoring. Yeah, pulse monitoring. It's just, to me, it's a form factor. Like, how do you want to authenticate? What's more comfortable for you? And it changes from person. And I think, making fingerprints a lot more acceptable. What is it, like 10 years later? Yes, 11 years ago, actually. So.
I guess I don't know why they're doing that, though. I mean, I think the fingerprint's good enough. I think the acceptance rates at this point, I don't know why we would need retinal scans to do a payment at the grocery store.
Probably not for a grocery store, but as an authentication method when you've gotten sort of a heightened security transaction, like you're wiring to buy a house for, $3 million. Is there additional authentication that you want? When humans start exiting the equation, you don't have these people coming to your house to make you sign a million things. Like, is that where a retina scan becomes a really important tool to, is it a much, much stronger authentication than a fingerprint, right? Supposedly you can spoof a fingerprint with a gummy bear.
Good to know.
I haven't tried it, but...
Can you give us a step-by-step tip? I mean, can we walk out of here knowing how to spoof fingerprints with gummy bears?
Yeah.
I guess last question, what has you, we've thrown a lot of cold water on payments in this session. What has you most excited about the space? What would get you to write a check tomorrow?
It is a really, of course, we look for really big markets. I mean, it's got to be, the total addressable market's got to be huge for any VC to make any money. And this is a huge market. And so I think for me, it's not about the US, because I don't think that's the hardest place to do it. And probably not even Europe, but I would say other more developing countries, even like South America still. I think there's huge opportunity to make payments more real time, because I think even over there it's tougher. So I would look geographically versus just within the sector in the US.
Yeah, I don't mean to throw a wet blanket on it. I love payments. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting ideas. Just making sure you're thinking about how you're truly adding value, not just at a superficial level, but really truly adding value, truly changing an experience. Like, I'm still super bullish on the B2B space. I think there's a ton of work that can be done to make it easier for businesses to focus on what they're really, really good at, and less on all the stuff that needs to happen in order to support the business. So,
wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.